Welcome to the psychology undergrad.
It is definitely that time of the semester. You can just feel it. Finals are right around the corner. The library is impossible to get a seat in. And we are cracking open our notes for what has to be one of the most intense units of the year.
That is so true. We're reviewing for the big one in developmental psychology.
Yeah.
And we are zeroing in on adoption. And I have to be honest with you.
Oh, yeah.
When I first saw adoption on the syllabus, I kind of, my eyes glazed over for a second. I thought, okay, this is going to be about legal stuff, family courts, maybe some heartwarming stories. I was getting ready to just skim the chapter.
And then you actually open the reading packet.
And then I opened the reading packet. And I realized how completely wrong I was. If you're listening right now and you think adoption is just a legal transaction, you need to really tune in. Because what we're looking at today is so much bigger than that.
It's huge. We're basically looking at adoption as a lens for the entire nature versus nurture debate, but not in some, philosophical way. We are talking about hard science, neurobiology. We're looking at how a person's earliest life experiences literally, physically shape the architecture of their brain.
We're talking about the HPA axis, stress, cortisol. And then on the flip side, the incredibly complicated social dynamics of what a family even means today.
We have a pretty serious stack of sources here. The main textbook stuff is from Dynamics of Modern Adoption, but the real heavy hitter is this massive paper from the Annual Review of Psychology.
Oh, the Grotevent and McDermott one. That thing is a beast.
It's basically the Bible for this topic. It's so dense.
Yeah, and we've also got some historical documents and transcripts about the history of the 60s scoop in Canada. We'll get to that later, but
All right.
Wow, that stuff it's heavy.
It is. The scope here is just massive. It's not just a child finds a home. We're talking biology, we're talking history, sociology, ethics, all of it.
And we are talking about history that, it gets pretty close to, or some would argue it is, genocide. It just makes you realize that psychology isn't this thing that just happens inside your own head. It's about what happens out in the world that fundamentally changes what's inside your head.
Precisely. That's the perfect way to put it.
But before we dive headfirst into the HPA axis and the neurobiology of stress, which I'm just giving you a heads up, is going to make you rethink every single all-nighter you have ever pulled.
For sure.
We have to talk about something that every single undergrad knows is basically gold. It's precious, and it is so, so rare.
Sleep.
Sleep. We are literally about to spend an hour talking about how stress destroys sleep patterns. But for you, our fellow student listening to this, we want to make sure you're actually getting some.
And that's why we're partnering with Cozy Earth for this review session.
Look, we all know what it's like. Dorm beds, that first sketchy apartment mattress. It's not exactly a luxury hotel.
Not even close.
But your sheets can be. And I'm not kidding. Cozy Earth's bamboo sheet set is a total game changer.
They're temperature regulating, which is huge. You know how in student housing, the thermostat is either set to Arctic blast or surface of the sun?
There is absolutely no in-between. It's one or the other. These sheets actually help you manage that. They've been called the best night of sleep for a very good reason.
And we know the student budget is a real struggle. Textbooks alone can break you. So we worked with them to get a discount that's actually, helpful.
It's 21% off, which is a really significant chunk of change when you're talking about quality sheets. You just use the promo code PSYC101. That's PSYC101- at cozyearth.com/Tasmade. Discount PSYC 101.
Seriously, it's an investment in your grades. Sleep is where memory consolidation happens. If you want to actually remember what we're about to say about the HPA axis, your brain needs those RM cycles.
It's a scientific necessity for studying.
Totally.
Okay, sponsor duty's done. Let's get back to the mission. We have a mountain of notes to get through.
Yeah.
So what is our main goal for this review session?
I think our mission is synthesis. We need to pull from the Dynamics of Modern Adoption textbook and that huge annual review paper and try to answer one really big question. How does this whole phenomenon of adoption, this sort of natural experiment, help us understand human resilience?
Yeah, the literature calls it a natural experiment, which I have to admit always sounds a little cold to me.
It does. It sounds very detached.
We're talking about children's lives,
Yeah.
Calling it an experiment feels clinical.
And I think any ethical researcher would acknowledge that. But from a purely scientific point of view, it gives us a window into something we could never, ever replicate in a lab.
Right. You can't just assign kids to different upbringings for science.
Of course not. But here you have it happening naturally. You have a child who starts life in one set of circumstances, often, adversity, deprivation, even trauma, and then they're moved into a completely different environment.
So it becomes the ultimate test case for nature versus nurture.
It is. It lets researchers ask these huge questions, like, can a loving, supportive family fix the biological impact of early trauma? Does a change in nurture override the initial biological programming?
And the teaser answer, as with everything in psychology, is it's complicated.
Very complicated. But before we get into the biology, we have to map out the landscape. We need to get the definitions straight, because if this is on the exam, we have to know the difference between the three main pathways to adoption.
Absolutely, the syllabus definitions. Let's start with number 1 on the list. Domestic adoption from the public child welfare system.
Okay, so in the U.S. and Canada, this is what we're usually talking about when we say kids are adopted from foster care.
In the context here is so important. This isn't usually the story of a newborn baby being placed for adoption.
Not at all. These are children who have been removed from their birth families by the state. And the reason is almost always severe maltreatment, abuse, neglect. The state has stepped in and, in most cases, terminated parental rights.
The scale of this is just...
Yeah.
It's hard to process. In the U.S., you're looking at over 400,000 children in the foster care system.
And of those, about 104,000 are legally free and waiting for adoption at any given time.
That's the size of a medium city. A city full of children just waiting for a permanent family. It's wild.
And the demographics are really different from other types of adoption. The average age is much older. It's around 6.4 years old when the adoption is finalized.
And the sources kept highlighting the high rates of special needs subsidies. When the textbook says special needs in this context, what are we really talking about? Is it just physical disabilities?
It can be, but it's much broader than that. It's a term that implies these children are often carrying the biological and emotional weight of their history.
So the trauma.
Exactly. They might have medical issues from neglect, developmental delays, or really significant emotional and behavioral challenges that come directly from the abuse they survived. The state provides these subsidies because it acknowledges that parenting these kids often requires more resources, specialized therapy, medical care, extra support in school that go way beyond the norm.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's pathway 1. Pathway number 2, domestic infant adoption, the private route.
Right. This is the one people probably think of more often. It's the story you see in movies, like Juno.
Right. A birth parent voluntarily decides to place their child, usually a newborn, with an adoptive family, and it happens through a private agency or an attorney.
But the textbook makes a really important and kind of a critical point about that word, voluntary.
It really does. It complicates the whole idea of what choice means.
Yeah. So in the U.S., there are roughly 14,000 of these private infant adoptions a year. But then you look over at Western Europe, and this kind of adoption is incredibly rare, almost non-existent in some places.
So what's the difference? Why is it so common here and not there?
It comes down to one thing: social safety nets.
Oh.
In a lot of Western European countries, if you're a single parent or a parent in poverty, there's robust support, universal health care, subsidized child care, direct financial aid.
So you're not forced into a corner.
Exactly. In that kind of system, a parent isn't forced to relinquish their child simply because they can't afford to raise them. But in the U.S., that voluntary choice is very often driven by economic desperation.
That's a huge sociological point. The idea of what's voluntary completely changes depending on your economic reality. It reminds me of that concept that poverty itself is a form of coercion.
It is. It's a systemic pressure that shapes what you think your options are.
Okay, so that's 2. The third pathway is international adoption.
Right. So this is any adoption that crosses national borders. And the key thing to remember for the exam here is the trend line.
It's been going down, right?
Way down. It peaked back in 2004 when about 23,000 children were adopted into the U.S. from other countries. But by 2011, it was under 10,000, and it's continued to decline.
I think my initial assumption would be that fewer people want to adopt internationally, but the reading suggests it's more about regulation and politics.
It's almost entirely geopolitical. The big turning point was something like the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption.
What did that do?
It basically professionalized and tightened up the whole process. It put in a lot of rules to prevent child trafficking and to make sure the practices were ethical. One of the biggest rules was that you had to prove you tried to find a family for the child in their own country first.
which logically would slow everything down.
That slows everything way down. And on top of that, major sending countries changed their own internal policies. China's economy boomed, so more Chinese families could afford to adopt domestically.
And Russia.
And Russia, yeah. Political tensions with the West led them to shut down adoptions to the U.S. completely for a long time.
Got it. And what about the Canadian context? Is it pretty much the same picture?
It is, yeah. It mirrors the U.S. pretty closely. You have the same three pathways, private, foster care, and international. The numbers are just different. In Canada, there are about 30,000 children in the welfare system available for adoption.
30,000. And how many are actually adopted each year?
Only about 2,000.
Wow. That is a massive gap. 30,000 waiting and only 2,000 getting placed.
It just shows you how overwhelmed the system is. And historically, for international adoption, Canada has drawn heavily from the same countries as the U.S., especially China and Haiti.
Okay. So we've got the landscape. We have our three main categories. Now we can pivot to the real core of this psych unit, the idea of adoption as a natural experiment.
Right, and this brings us right back to that central question we started with. If you take a child out of a really deprived environment, let's say an orphanage with very little human contact or stimulation, and you place them in a loving, enriched family home, what actually happens?
The big learning objective here is basically, does love conquer all? Or, to put it more scientifically, does an enriched environment conquer early biological adversity?
And to even begin to answer that, we have to go deep into the biology. We have to start with the HPA axis.
This was all over the annual review paper. The HPA axis, that's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
We have to get really specific here because it's not just a concept, it's a mechanism. You should think of the HPA axis as the body's central alarm system. It's the whole cascade of hormones that responds to a threat.
The stress triangle.
That's a good way to think of it. But let's actually trace the signal, because the problem in early adversity isn't just feeling stressed. It's a mechanical failure in the system's feedback loop.
Okay, walk me through it. So let's say I'm an infant in an institution. I'm hungry, or my diaper is wet, or I'm just alone and scared. What happens first?
First, your amygdala, the brain's little threat detector, it just lights up. It starts screaming, danger.
And the amygdala talks to the hypothalamus.
Right. The hypothalamus gets the signal and it pings the pituitary gland. The pituitary then releases a chemical messenger into the bloodstream that travels all the way down to the adrenal glands, which are sitting right on top of your kidneys.
And then the adrenals are what dump cortisol into this system.
Boom. Cortisol floods your body. Your heart rate shoots up. Your body dumps sugar into your muscles for energy. You are physically ready for fight or flight. But here is the absolute key, and the textbook really hammered this home.
What's that?
Cortisol is supposed to be a self-limiting chemical.
Meaning it's designed to turn itself off.
It should. In a healthy, functioning brain, that cortisol travels back up through the bloodstream. It binds to special receptors in the hippocampus, and it basically sends a message that says, okay, we got it. Threat is over. You can turn off the alarm now.
It's a negative feedback loop, like a thermostat in a house. When the room gets hot enough, tells the furnace to shut off.
Perfect analogy. But for a child experiencing chronic adversity, neglect, abuse, or just sitting alone in a crib for 18 hours a day, the threat never goes away.
Yeah.
The room never cools down.
The alarm button is just jammed in the on position?
Exactly. The system is constantly being taxed. It creates a state of chronic hyperarousal. And eventually, the receptors in the brain that are supposed to listen for cortisol, they just stop listening.
They burn out.
They downregulate. It's like if you move into an apartment right next to a train station. The first week, the trains wake you up every night. After a year, you don't even hear them anymore. But your body is still feeling the vibration. That's the biological tax we're talking about. It's not a mood. It's a physiological rewriting of how your body manages stress.
You know, it reminds me of that book, The Body Keeps the Score. It almost feels like a moral or even a religious concept.
Oh, so?
Just the idea that suffering isn't just an abstract memory. It's not just a story you tell. It's literally written into the biology of a person. The body physically keeps a record of it.
It really does. The biological cost of suffering is tangible. And this constant cortisol flood, it affects everything. It suppresses the immune system, it messes with your mood, and critically for this unit, it directly affects physical growth.
Okay, we have to stop on psychosocial short stature for a minute, because this was the part of the reading where I literally had to put my highlighter down and just process it.
It's a wild, wild phenomenon.
It sounds like something out of science fiction. You're telling me that a child can be given enough calories, they can be literally eating enough food to grow, but they stop growing because they don't have love.
It totally forces you to redefine what nutrition even means. We think of nutrition as calories, protein, vitamins, but this data strongly suggests that emotional security is a biological nutrient.
So stress hormones can actually block growth hormones.
That's exactly what happens. High levels of cortisol can suppress the production of human growth hormone. It's like the body goes into a wartime economy.
A wartime economy.
Think about it. If your HPA axis is going haywire 24/7, your body thinks it is constantly under attack. It thinks it's in a war zone.
And in a war zone, you're not going to spend your resources building new skyscrapers.
No, you pour all your concrete into building bunkers. You divert all your energy to immediate survival, to the immune system, to the muscles, to vigilance, growth, building bone density, getting taller. Those are peacetime luxuries. The body literally puts a hold on them to survive the immediate threat.
The statistic in the paper was so specific. For every 2 to 3 months a child spends in an institutional setting,
They might lose 1 month of linear growth.
you can literally measure emotional neglect with a ruler. It's heartbreaking.
It's a massive, massive deficit.
But then, and here's the nature versus nurture twist, the plasticity part. What happens when they get adopted? When the war is over?
The catch-up growth is incredible. The sources all talk about this massive recovery. If a child is adopted, especially if it's before they're 12 months old, their height and weight often just skyrocketed back up to the normal percentiles on the growth chart.
It's like the body breathes this huge sigh of relief and says, okay, we're safe. We have food. We have touch. We have love. Time to grow.
It shows just how incredibly responsive our bodies are to a caring environment. However, there's an exception.
There's always an exception in psychology, isn't there?
There is head circumference.
Which is basically our best proxy for measuring brain growth.
Exactly. So while a child's height and weight might completely recover, the sources indicate that head circumference, and by extension the total volume of the brain, sometimes doesn't catch up as fully, especially if the deprivation was really severe or lasted for a long time.
And the paper said this can actually reemerge later in life.
It can, yeah. The annual review paper specifically mentioned that sometimes these growth issues seem to be totally resolved in childhood, but then during the hormonal surge of adolescence, particularly for girls who were in those infamous Romanian orphanages, the growth lag can show up again.
It's like a biological echo of that early trauma years later.
It's exactly that, a ghost in the machine.
So let's crack open the skull, metaphorically speaking, and look at the brain structure itself. For the exam, we definitely need to be able to distinguish between gray matter and white matter.
Right. This is straight up neuroscience 101, but applied to the context of adoption. So gray matter is the neurons themselves. It's the cell bodies, the processing centers of the brain.
And white matter is the wiring.
Exactly. It's the myelin-coated axons that connect all those different processing centers. It's the brain's information superhighway.
And early life adversity, it hits both of them.
It does. Severe neglect can reduce the total volume of both. But, and this is a key point, the research suggests that the white matter, the connections, shows more plasticity.
So the wiring can be repaired.
It seems so, yeah. Studies show it can improve significantly after a child is placed in foster care. You can rebuild the highways.
But the gray matter, the actual neurons, that's harder to recover.
It appears to be more stubborn. The loss in neuron volume is a deeper injury, it seems.
I really like the analogy they used in our notes for this. Think of the brain like the foundation of a house.
Yeah, that's a good one.
If the foundation, your early life experience, is shaky or was poured with poor materials, you can still renovate the house later. That's plasticity. You can put up new drywall. You can fix the plumbing. You can paint the walls. That's the white matter recovering.
Right, the cosmetic and functional fixes.
But the structural integrity of the house, the actual concrete slab of the foundation, if that was poured during a time of scarcity and stress, it is so much harder to go back and fix that without doing major structural work.
And a core part of that foundation is the limbic system, the brain's emotional center.
The amygdala and the hippocampus, we have to break those down.
Okay, so the amygdala, we already mentioned it. It's the threat detector.
And in post-institutionalized children, the research often finds an enlarged amygdala.
Right. It's overdeveloped. It's hypervigilant. It has been trained to look for danger absolutely everywhere.
Which, it makes perfect sense from an adaptation standpoint. If you spent your first year or two in a scary, unpredictable, threatening place, your brain adapted to survive that specific environment.
It's a brilliant adaptation that then becomes maladaptive when you're moved to a safe, loving home. You're safe now, but your amygdala is still screaming, danger! every single time a door slams or someone raises their voice.
And what about the hippocampus?
So that's the center for learning and memory. And stress has basically poisoned the hippocampus. The high levels of cortisol we talked about can literally damage and kill hippocampal cells.
Which is why we often see memory issues in children who experienced early neglect.
Right. And this connects directly to the next big point on our outline, sleep. Because sleep is when the hippocampus does all its important filing work, right? It's consolidating memories from the day.
Correct. And of course, stress completely disrupts sleep. The sources were full of examples of adopted kids, especially from tough backgrounds, struggling with night waking, with nightmares, with just being unable to fall asleep.
It's such a vicious cycle. The high cortisol from the stress ruins their sleep. Then the poor sleep hurts their emotional regulation and memory formation, which in turn leads to more stress the next day.
But again, there's a hopeful note in the data here. Responsive caregiving, literally just a parent being there, comforting the child, reestablishing a feeling of safety night after night, it can actually repair those broken sleep cycles.
And when the sleep gets better, the brain gets better. It all connects.
Okay, let's move out of the biology lab and into the classroom. Part 3, cognitive function. And we have to make a really clear distinction here for the exam between IQ and executive function.
Yes, this is such a critical distinction. It's basically the difference between knowing the answer to a question and being able to successfully organize yourself to take the test.
So let's start with IQ.
On measures of general intelligence, or IQ, adopted children show a massive improvement compared to their peers who are left behind in institutions. The enriched environment of a family, the language, the interaction, it provides a huge boost.
So they're smart. They have the cognitive horsepower.
Yes, the raw intelligence is often there and totally normal. But then we have to look at executive function, or EF.
A CEO of the brain.
That's the perfect term for it. It's all the skills managed by your prefrontal cortex. Things like planning, impulse control, working memory, attention, organization.
And this is where the major disconnect can happen. You can have a kid with a normal or even a high IQ who struggles profoundly with their executive function.
Exactly. The sources list out these really specific deficits. Things like inhibitory control, which is just the ability to stop an impulse, to not blurt something out.
Working memory.
Yeah, holding information in your head long enough to use it, like trying to follow a 3-step instruction. And then there's attention. The rates of ADHD symptoms in post-institutionalized kids are significantly higher than in the general population.
So if you think about it from our perspective, as a student, imagine trying to study for finals. You are smart enough to understand all the material, your IQ is fine, but your brain's CEO, your prefrontal cortex, has weak or inefficient connections to the rest of your brain because of that early neglect.
You can't stay focused. You can't stop the urge to check your phone every 2 minutes. You can't figure out how to organize your notes into a coherent study guide. It isn't a lack of intelligence, it's a lack of executive control.
And that's a direct biological result of that shaky foundation we were talking about earlier.
Precisely. It explains so much about why some adopted children might really struggle in a traditional school setting, even though they're incredibly bright.
Okay, we're making a hard pivot now. We're leaving the neuroscience lab and we're walking down the hall of the history department. And this is the really heavy part of the unit. We need to talk about the 60s scoop.
This is such a critical piece of the Canadian context, but the same patterns happened with Indigenous peoples in the U.S. and Australia. It's just a brutal example of what happens when the concept of nurture is weaponized by the state.
Let's start with the definition. What was the 60s scoop?
It refers to the widespread practice, mostly from the 1960s through the 1980s, of child welfare authorities taking Indigenous or Aboriginal children from their families and communities and placing them in non-Aboriginal, almost exclusively white, homes for adoption.
And the legal catalyst for this was an amendment to the Indian Act back in 1951, specifically Section 52.
Right. That amendment essentially gave the federal Minister of Indian Affairs control over Indigenous children, allowing provincial child welfare agencies to come onto reserves and remove children, bypassing the parents and the community entirely.
The statistics you see from this period are they're terrifying. In 1951, in the entire province of British Columbia, there were only 29 Aboriginal children in provincial care, just 29.
And by 1964, just over a decade later, that number had jumped to 1,466.
So they went from being 1% of the children in care to over 34% of all children in care in a little over 10 years.
And you have to ask the question, why? Was there some sudden, massive epidemic of bad parenting happening in indigenous communities? The answer is absolutely not. The source material is crystal clear on this.
It was cultural bias.
It was what our notes call the social worker's gaze.
Yeah.
We have to really try and picture this interaction. You have a social worker who is almost certainly white, middle class, and operating from a completely Euro-Canadian worldview, and they walk into a home on a reserve.
And they are looking for signs of safety and good parenting based on their world, their standards.
Exactly. So they look around and they don't see a refrigerator. They don't see cupboards stocked with canned goods. Maybe the kids aren't sleeping in separate beds in separate rooms. Instead, they see traditional foods being preserved: dried game, fish, berries. They see multiple generations of an extended family living and sleeping in a communal space.
And they looked at a completely functional, traditional indigenous home and saw neglect.
They conflated poverty, a poverty that was often a direct result of colonial policies, with bad parenting. But it was more than that. They judged the culture itself as bad parenting. They didn't understand the vital role of extended family or the traditional ways of raising children, so they took the kids away to save them.
It's the white savior complex in action, isn't it? Even if you assume some of them had good intentions, the result was catastrophic cultural destruction.
And the impact on the children was, essentially, identity erasure. The sources tell these horrible stories of children being placed in white homes and being lied to about their heritage. They were told they were French or Italian, anything but indigenous. Their names were changed. They were punished for speaking their language.
Can you imagine what that does to you? Growing up, looking in the mirror every day and knowing you don't look Italian, but being systematically gaslit by your own family and by the state about the most fundamental thing about you, who you are.
The psychological damage is just immense. The texts use the term genealogical bewilderment, which sounds so academic, but it just means being completely lost, unmoored from your own history. And the outcomes were devastating: loss of culture, language, community, tribal identity, leading to incredibly high rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction.
And this is where it brings up the really heavy question of genocide.
It does, and you have to be careful with that word, but you also have to look at the official definitions. The 1948 UN Convention on Genocide includes, right in its definition, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
If the intent is to assimilate a group and destroy their distinct culture by removing their next generation, it fits the definition.
It is a very, very sobering reminder that adoption is not always a benevolent act of charity. It can be an act of violence. It can be a tool of colonialism.
And it completely changes how we have to look at modern policy. Today, the priority is to keep the circle of the community intact. The first choice is always extended family, then other families from the same Aboriginal nation. Placing a child outside of their community is the absolute last resort.
Which actually transitions us perfectly into our last section, Part 5, Modern Social Processes. Because we are still, as a society, figuring out how to do family right, the whole definition is in flux.
It really is. We're moving away from that old era of secrets and shame.
And that brings us to open adoption. This is increasingly the new normal.
Right. The old model of sealed records, where a woman gives birth, the baby is just whisked away, and they're told to forget about each other and never speak again, that's fading out. Open adoption just means there is some form of contact between the birth family and the adoptive family.
Now, I'll play devil's advocate here because this is the first thing everyone always asks. Doesn't that just confuse the kid?
Right. Who is my real mom?
Exactly. I mean, you have two sets of parents. Does the kid feel torn? Does it create loyalty conflicts?
That's the myth. It's the pervasive myth. But the research, especially in that Grodevant and McDermott paper, is very clear. It's false.
It doesn't increase confusion or behavioral problems.
In fact, it does the opposite. It helps with what the psychologists call identity formation.
How does it do that?
Well, because there are no giant, scary secrets. There's no phantom other mother that the child has to fantasize about or be afraid of. If an adoption is totally closed, the child's mind has to fill in the blanks. And they often create these wild fantasies. Either my birth parents were royalty who had to give me up for a secret reason, or they were horrible monsters who threw me away.
But if you actually know them, or even just have pictures and letters, they're just people.
They're just people. It grounds the child in reality.
Yeah.
But the paper made a really important point. The key metric for success isn't just having contact.
It's the satisfaction with the contact.
Exactly. You can have an open adoption that's full of conflict and stress, and that's not good for anyone. And you can have a technically closed adoption where the adoptive parents are incredibly open and communicative. They talk about the birth parents with respect and love, and that can work really well.
The term to remember for the exam here is emotional distance regulation.
I love that term. It's so descriptive. It frames these relationships as a kind of dance.
It's not static.
No. Sometimes you're close, you're interacting a lot. Other times one party might need some space. You are constantly collaboratively regulating that distance. It requires a huge amount of emotional intelligence from everyone involved.
It's like managing in-laws, but with the complexity turned up to 11.
That is a very good analogy. It is advanced extended family management.
Okay, next modern dynamic on the list. Same-sex parenting, the psych undergrad view.
This has been a huge area of research for decades now, for obvious political and social reasons. The big research question has always been, do children who are raised by gay or lesbian parents have different developmental outcomes?
And the answer from the research is
No.
it's that clear.
It's about as clear as anything gets in psychology. When you look at all the major metrics, psychological adjustment, cognitive development, gender role behavior, emotional stability, there are no significant differences on average when compared to children raised by heterosexual parents. The no difference consensus in the literature is incredibly strong.
But there are some nuances, right? The notes mention something about play.
Yeah, this part is fascinating. There's some evidence that children of same-sex parents engage in less gender-typed play.
Meaning what? Boys might be more likely to play with dolls and girls with trucks.
Exactly. Less rigid stereotypes. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. If your family consists of 2 moms or 2 dads, you're already living a life that models that gender roles aren't fixed or strict. Your family is breaking the traditional script just by existing.
So it's not that the kids are confused about their gender identity, they're just more flexible in their expression of it.
Precisely. But the single most important factor that predicts a child's behavior and well-being isn't their parent's sexual orientation, it's parenting stress.
It always comes back to stress.
Always. And this is where the external social context bites back hard. If a same-sex couple is living in a state with discriminatory laws or in a community that is hostile and unsupportive, that external pressure increases their stress. And that parental stress then flows down and affects the child.
So if a child in a same-sex family is having a hard time, it's probably not because their parents are gay. It's because society is making it hard for their parents to be gay.
That's what the data suggests. It's the external pressure, not the internal family structure. That's the risk factor.
Okay, last social dynamic. Transracial adoption.
This connects all the way back to the 60s scoop. But in a modern, voluntary context, we're talking mostly about white parents adopting children of color.
And the big shift in thinking here has been moving away from a colorblind approach
To a cultural socialization approach.
For a long, long time, the advice given to white adoptive parents was, love is enough. Just pretend race doesn't matter. We are all the same under the skin.
Which sounds lovely on a greeting card, but we now know is actually really terrible advice for raising a child of color.
It's actively harmful because the world is not colorblind. If you raise a black child in a white family and you teach them that race doesn't matter, you are sending them out into a world that will absolutely treat them differently because of their race, and you've given them 0 tools to understand or cope with it. You're gaslighting their lived reality.
So the sources outline these 2 different parenting strategies. The first is cultural socialization.
Right, so CS is the positive stuff. It's actively teaching the child about their heritage, instilling pride, celebrating traditions.
This is the fun stuff. Going to festivals, cooking the food, learning about the holidays.
Exactly. And the research shows that many white parents are actually pretty good at this part. They'll go to the Lunar New Year parade. They'll learn to cook traditional dishes. But they often avoid the second crucial part, preparation for bias.
The hard stuff.
This is explicitly warning the child about discrimination. It's talking openly about racism. It's making conscious choices, like living in a diverse neighborhood so your child isn't the only person of color in their entire school.
And the paradox, the notes mentioned, is that a lot of parents will do the fun festival, but they won't do the hard work of moving to the diverse neighborhood.
Because moving is hard. Confronting your own privilege and comfort is hard. But the data is so clear on this. Children who are prepared for bias, the ones who are given the language to understand racism when they encounter it, they handle discrimination much better. They experience less stress because they have a framework. They know, this isn't my fault. This is the world's problem.
It's a moral duty, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you choose to adopt a child of another race, you take on the duty to validate their racial reality, even if that reality makes you, as a white parent, uncomfortable.
Absolutely. You cannot claim to love the child and simultaneously ignore a fundamental part of their identity and how the world will treat them. That is its own form of neglect.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground. We've gone from the HPA axis to the Indian Act to modern open adoption. Let's try to boil it down. What are the key takeaways for the exam and, for just being a thoughtful human?
Okay, takeaway 1. Adoption is a process, not a single event. It's a lifelong journey that involves the adoptee, the adoptive family, and the birth family in some capacity.
Takeaway 2. The biological risks of early adversity are very real. Stress leaves a physical mark on the brain and the body. That tax on the HPA axis is a real debt. But, and this is a big concept piece, but plasticity is incredibly powerful. Recovery is possible, especially in things like white matter development and catch-up growth.
Takeaway 3, context is everything. The social worker's gaze during the 60s scoop is a brutal lesson that what we think of as good parenting is often just our own cultural bias. And that bias can be used to destroy families.
And final takeaway, love is absolutely essential, but it is not enough. You also need skill. You need the skill to navigate the complexities of open adoption, the skill to talk honestly about race, and the skill to parent a child who has experienced trauma.
All of this leaves me with one final kind of provocative thought.
Go for it.
We talk so much about the child's plasticity. We focus on the brain's amazing ability to recover, to catch up, to adapt. We put the entire burden of resilience on the shoulders of the kid.
Right. We expect them to be the ones who bounce back.
But if a child's brain is so plastic that it can recover from severe early trauma, but then society, through systemic racism or cultural erasure or homophobia, creates new trauma for them, are we maybe focusing too much on the child's biology and not enough on the society we're asking them to be resilient in?
So is the cure for early adversity just a loving family? Or is it a just and equitable society?
That's the question I'm left with.
That is definitely something to mull over while you're studying. And that is a wrap on adoption.
Indeed.
All right, class dismissed. And please don't forget, if you want to help your own HPA axis calm down and actually get some restorative rest, give those poor glucocorticoid receptors a break. Check out Cozy Earth. Use that code PSYC101 for 21% off.
Good luck on the exam, everyone.
See you next time.